Bradl Jersak, very warm welcome to the Spiritual Misfits podcast.
Thanks for having me, Will. I've been looking forward to this.
I was just saying to you just before we hit record that it's such a privilege for someone like me who's read a lot of your books and been significantly influenced by your thought to actually be able to meet and have a conversation. I think anybody who's read something or watched something or listened to something that's been formative for them, feels that it's just such the gravity of meeting that person is wonderful. So yeah, I don't take this for granted.
Well, the gravity's lighter when you remember the glitches in my story, right? So, but it is good to meet you. I'm grateful for the hospitality.
Yeah, and I appreciate the honesty and the vulnerability in your books as well. You definitely talk about the complexity and the messy nature of the journey. You have written extensively about the moment we're in and the kind of faith shifts that people are going through. Your most recent book was sort of dealing with, faith after the great deconstruction. Out of the Embers is the title of that one. And one of my favorite talks from you actually is where you give a range of alternative metaphors to this kind of deconstruction word that is frequently used. That's just a side note if people want to go and look at that. But I'm interested in just starting with your own journey, the kind of shifts you went through growing up, sort of dispensationalist Baptist and then moving into Orthodox Christianity. When did you feel like a spiritual misfit along the way, and what were some of the key shifts in your own personal faith journey in earlier years?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it does cover some of the range that I talk about in that book, where parts of this were theological shift, parts were very much more experiential and even trauma-based. Parts were voluntary and joyful, parts were involuntary and like kicking and dragging and screaming. And so I'm old enough to have had a few of those. So my faith journey includes really big phases. So like you said, I grew up a dispensationalist Baptist. That's the first 22 years of my life. And I'm grateful to say that before the toxic stuff got in when I was about 8 years old, specifically like Armageddon, Hellfire, Revivalism, all of that stuff, I did learn to love Jesus on my mom's lap from the time she first told me his name. And at that very early stage, that prayer was intimate, and I experienced the presence and reality of Jesus as friend in that way, very close to me. And then also a deep love for scriptures as soon as I could read. So that got in ahead of some of the weird stuff and has never left me. And then, but I was gratefully, in my master's degree, I eventually thought I would love to teach Bible and theology. And so I was doing my master's, and the school I was in and the teachers that I had were all making this shift out of dispensationalism at once. And so that was easy and helpful. Unfortunately, I also picked up a bad case of Calvinism for a few years there. But at that point, I got married, and my wife's church invited me to come on as a youth worker, an outreach worker, college and career kind of pastor. And they were Mennonite, which is very Jesus-centered, very Sermon on the Mount centered. And I spent 10 years doing that and really loving working with the community kids that many had never darkened the door of a church. So I had to really boil down, like, what is the gospel anyway? And how do I bring Jesus to people who've never been part of a Christian tradition? So the shift there was more to that like Sermon on the Mount, ethical, nonviolent kind of approach. And at the same time, a lot of those kids have been molested or gone through sexual assaults of various kinds. So we learned the inner healing stuff the hard way through those years and saw Jesus move in profound ways. So part of what my stability has been the experience of watching Jesus dramatically heal people from serious trauma kind of issues. And I don't know if people know this, but all the trauma-informed counseling, the foundations of that were the Christian inner healing movement, as cynical as we want to be about other stuff. After 10 years there, I really got involved in the renewal movement, and Eden and I planted a church with a focus on people with disabilities, people with addictions, people on the margins. but also an openness to charismatic stuff that I would have mocked as a young Baptist, right? And but also, the Calvinism just fell off during those Mennonite years, and gratefully, we could just, again, seeing God active in that community was so profound for me. So all of this was the theological transitions were liberating. Like any changes I made felt more free and more beautiful and a more expansive gospel and a more active experience of God that who's transforming and healing people, and that in discovering there's just that there's no retribution in the nature of God. And we could
Mm.
see this. Here's the problem. 2008, my life blew up because I just was completely overwhelmed by the amount of tragedy that working in those communities brings with it.
Mm.
Horrendous stuff in the addictions community where we were having overdose deaths and gruesome murder, an abduction of someone who had gone down to serve in an orphanage in Central America, and then and my inner healing silver bullet wasn't working. And finally I just was unraveling, and someone in this tequila addict who'd been sober for 15 years said, dude, you're unraveling, you need to get in a program. And
Mm.
so and she probably invited me too late, because at that point I just started in being overwhelmed and not being able to face those emotions, experiencing addictive, harmful behavior. And ultimately, I just couldn't function. And gratefully, when I stepped down from the church, instead of being cast out or kicked down, they carried me. We co-created a community who could love me and take care of me well when I couldn't anymore. So that was really neat. I didn't have the betrayal of the church thing going. No, they could have
Mm.
identified betrayal in me, but I just had nothing but kindness for them. Meanwhile, okay, so then I left pastoring forever. And meanwhile, I met Archbishop Lazar, a monk at a Orthodox monastery near here, and all of his he could see through all of this stuff, and he saw where I was struggling. He saw where my theology needed some healing yet, although I was mostly there. But to have someone who's not just let's say someone who's lost their faith and they're off the limb progressive liberal or something. No, this guy knows the ancient faith, and he said, no, your instincts are right on. God is not retributive. God has nothing for you but mercy, and that this is the whole program. And I could
Mm.
see how 12-step recovery and the Orthodox liturgical world dovetailed really well in a program of recovery from self-will, recovery from all the things that were killing me. And so by the and then I got into PhD studies as a way to go ask some of these hard questions. And I that's where I encountered the writings of Simone Weil, Weil,
Mm-hmm.
and in some ways, she was part of saving my life at that point. I had really despaired. But yeah, so through like 2009 to 2012 or 13, I got good care. I had a counselor, I had a spiritual director, and I had this old monk who would hold me by the hand. And it's an embarrassment of riches in terms of a healing team. And
Mm.
then by the time I finished my PhD, I was welcomed into the academic world, and I've been working at St. Stephen's University, where I'm now the principal. And if anyone wants to check that out, it's ssu.ca, not .com. We're in Canada, but we've got a lot of Australian students. So
Yeah.
um, we're you're able to work online with us to get a master's degree in some of these things. Anyway, that's my commercial break there. But you can
That's
see how
very
I
welcome.
have had these stages of faith. I will say right now I'm attending an Episcopal church. as much as I love Orthodox theology, I still consider myself Orthodox in that way. I love their liturgy. I even love the pageantry, but the Christian nationalism that has taken hold in Russia and America has overwhelmed Orthodoxy with something very ugly and demonic, in my opinion.
Mm, mm,
And I know very good Orthodox people who are my friends, but they are under the gun from this kind of wave of, um, the 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 MAGA movement in America, and then the pro-Putin people in Russia, and it's so bad. And so I'm like,
right.
whatever that is, I'm not that. So
Yeah.
I've been enjoying this little fellowship of Episcopalians that kind of get stuff, I think, and but no
Mm,
pressure on me. I just attend, and that's that.
yeah. Yeah. Oh, it's a beautiful and winding story that you have, Brad, and I appreciate you sharing even a brief version of it.
It's long. I'm 61 now, so sorry.
No, don't be sorry. Don't be sorry. I think it was about 8 years ago that I first discovered your book, A More Christlike God, A More Beautiful Gospel. I
Hmm.
was in my first pastoral role at the time, and I was rethinking a lot of things. I was a young dad at the time as well, and there was lots of shifts happening in my life, and I was managing kind of carefully the shifts between the private faith and then the public expectations of pastoral ministry in that context.
Yep.
And reading your book, it was sort of really speaking to many of these tensions that I was wrestling with around the perceived differences between God the Father and Jesus of Nazareth, who
Right.
seems at times far more compassionate, more Christ-like. And I guess it was probably the fullest and richest dive into a more kinder and broader and actually good news gospel that I had kind of wanted to believe, but didn't feel like my tradition or my reading of scripture to that point had really made room for.
Mm.
And I'd love for you to unpack the case a little bit more for, swapping out these images of a God who is retributive and who is ultimately violent and vengeful, but, kind of just puts that on hold and gives us a temporary reprieve with Jesus, but will one day resume being, just, yeah.
That's so horrible, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yep.
How did you make that shift, or how would you help people that have been totally entrenched in that view of God and they're afraid to question it? How do we move into a non-punitive and non-wrathful, in that sense, understanding of God?
Yeah, there's probably a few paths. So, first of all, like you could do a biblical theological path that is, like I said, not just sort of out on the limb progressive, but it's go down to the roots of the tradition. So you
Mm,
could go that path. That would be a more academic one that I do want to share with a little bit. Or you can go a much more experiential one. It's like, have you ever actually experienced like God like that? Is that how He works in the world right now? Um, and maybe we think He does, but um, especially for when I watch how He works, not only with people who were victims of terrible sin, but predators out of prison and their encounters with Jesus, and there was just nothing retributive other than the consequences of their own acts. But like
mm,
God doesn't show up to as the agent of those consequences, and this was so consistent over so many decades now. I've never once seen a God different than the Jesus we see in the Gospels. It just never happens. So let's go back to the biblical theological side of it. So in terms of, or pastorally speaking, then I will run into the following kind of images of God. There is the God who's angry, punitive, and judgmental. That kind of God. That's one image that I run into with a lot of people, and not only those with bad theological training, but people who've never been in a church before. It's
mm,
like Adam and Eve, where the moment they stumble, they create a toxic, angry image of God out of the dust of their own shame.
mm,
So it's their shame that creates it. Then they may find a theology that resonates with that. But like Adam and Eve have to go hide. Why? They actually had a damaged image of God rooted in tripping. But there's other kinds of images too. There's also the absent God who's abandoned them, like the deadbeat dad. And it's like, where was he when I needed him? And he wasn't there, and I cried out to him, he didn't answer me. So that one's not so much angry as absent, and who's abdicated his responsibility in the world, whether it's through personal trauma or watch the news tonight. Where's God in that, right? And they're like, he's obviously left, right? And then there's the other one I ran into a lot in the renewal movement. My goodness, there's a lot of shady stuff there that actually generated the MAGA movement. It's very responsible for what happened to that. And in that case, it was sort of like the prayer warriors were going to pull down heaven and manipulate circumstances. And if you rub the genie bottle the right way, God will give you your wishes. Or if you look at him the right way, maybe he'll be like a fairy godmother to you. And so we end up thinking like, oh, God's is the fulfiller of all my wish dreams, until he isn't, right? And then you crash and you get cynical. So we've got these false images, and then I'm like, well, could we just double check? And what we read in the scriptures is, no one has seen God at any time except God, the only Son, who's in the bosom of the Father. He has made him known. So every image of God we have in the scriptures is an incomplete one compared to the image Jesus presents. And then he says, I am the image. Paul will say, Jesus Christ is the image of the invisible God. He's the only image we have that accurately portrays the nature of the Father as love. And so the way Archbishop Lazar taught me, this old monk, he looks like Gandalf, by the way. I just saw him a few hours ago. and he just says, every scripture that claims to be a revelation of God must bow to the living God when he came in the flesh. So we read the entire scriptures through the lens of Jesus on the Emmaus Road, where he says, everything is prefiguring me, and in imperfect, limited ways. So and then we read Paul say to the Colossians that all the fullness of the Godhead is the Trinity, Father, Son, and Spirit. All the fullness of the Godhead dwelled in Jesus in bodily form. And so that's why Jesus can say, look, the Father's not different than me. To see me is to see the Father in his character, right? And that character we read finally in 1 John is that God is love. And anyone who loves knows God. And anyone who says that they know God and they don't love, they're lying to themselves, to others. And this beautiful passage in chapter 4 of 1 John, where he says, perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. And the one who fears is not made perfect in love. They haven't seen God in his fullness yet. And if you want to see God in his fullness, you actually do the counterintuitive thing and look at the cross, where you see God as self-giving, radically forgiving, co-suffering love, period. And that's the tradition. These other things, weird, ugly images, tend to be more modernist and from literal readings of scripture, where that's just not okay, So Jesus shows us a better way to read scripture as well. That's why I did the follow-up book later, A More Christ-Like Word, and it is reading scripture the Jesus Emmaus way. Yeah.
Both books I strongly recommend to people. You mentioned there that, one of the things we need to do is to look at Jesus on the cross as sort of an antidote to some of those images.
Yeah.
One of the doctrines that actually holds up, I think, a lot of this, unhealthy disparity between the Father and the Son is penal substitutionary atonement.
Yeah.
And for many evangelicals, that's the whole cake. It's like baked in, if you don't have God dying, killing Jesus basically as the transactional, atoning offering for your sin, then you don't have a gospel. Yeah. And I wonder if you could, for people that are still trying to get their head around, if I let go of penal substitutionary atonement, is there a gospel here? Is there a good news here? Why did Jesus die? What did the cross accomplish or demonstrate? I know that's a question that could fill many podcasts and many books, but how do you kind of give the nutshell version of
Yeah, I'll
what's
try
happening
for
there that's better?
the elevator pitch.
Yeah.
So people knew. I grew up believing that penal substitutionary atonement, that is that was the gospel, not even an atonement theory. It was just the gospel, and the idea is that God cannot actually forgive sin,
Mm.
contrary to what the Bible says. Um, I heard myself preaching that God cannot forgive sin. He has to punish it. He can either punish it in his son in your place by pouring out all his wrath on his son in order to satisfy his wrath. So God's accountable to some other thing called justice, or he can punish it in you forever in hell. And this was the
Mm.
gospel. So take your pick, go to hell forever, or let Jesus be punished in your stead. And if you want the Jesus one, then like you pray this prayer and you're in, and it's okay. And the problem, there's so many problems with that, is it pits God against Jesus for one, as if they're like, where is God on Good Friday? Zechariah 12 tells us way ahead of time that you will look on Yahweh, the one you have pierced. He's on the cross. Paul says God was in Christ, reconciling the world to himself, not counting their sins against them. So he doesn't have to count sins. He doesn't have to punish sins. He can literally forgive them. He can pardon them because he comes in the flesh to bear what we've done in himself and then forgive it. So this idea that it's really kind of a heresy to pit the Father against the Son in any way, as if they have different character and one is
Mm.
punishing the other. And we would use, and by the way, I also did my master's thesis defending that view, 180 pages defense. So
Right.
people shouldn't think that I'm just doing a caricature. This is what I wrote on. This is what I preached. Maybe others don't. That's good, but I did.
Mm.
So what I discovered was that's not an ancient doctrine. That's 500 years old. That's a bit too recent to be calling it the gospel. So how did they preach the cross in the early church? They begin with the nature of God as love, and all these church fathers would say to assign anger or wrath in any literal way to God is, John Cassian said it this way in the 300s, it is a monstrous blasphemy, and it is idolatry actually. And so he and many of the other church fathers, who you can see in the appendix of my More Christ-like Word book, they all just said, wrath or anger is a metaphor for our experience of the consequences of our sin. It's not literally God as the agent of punishment. That's not love.
Mm.
So whatever judgments God brings, it's restorative. It's Hebrews 12 says that that this is the loving Father raising us up again. So then what's the cross about? So that's the worry. If I don't have penal substitution, then the cross means nothing. That's not true. It means two great things. One is it is the definitive statement about who God is. God is self-giving, radically forgiving, co-suffering. That means he suffers with us. He bears these burdens in himself. Every assault, every bullet, every bomb, every rape, every sin that you've ever experienced or committed for all of history, he draws up into himself, swallows it in love, and releases forgiveness into the world and healing into the world. So
Mm.
it's the definitive revelation of the nature of God. But it's also the second big thing, the decisive victory over Satan, sin, and death. So in the early church, they have this hymn that we sing to this day in the Eastern churches. Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death. And on those in the tombs bestowing life. So this comes from Hebrews 2, where it says, he took flesh so that he could be like one of us, and through his death destroy death and the devil, who used the fear of death as leverage on us all of our lives. And so there's this decisive victory over death, where death is done. You can't, so death as like ending up in non-being. It's like, no, we pass through death. Like now it's become a birth canal into an eternal life. And it destroys death. It destroys the fear of death, and it eradicates sin through forgiveness. What's the mechanism? There isn't one. You don't have to have a transaction. Forgiveness is actually him saying, you're released. There's no need for punishment here. Why not? Because I forgave you. How can you do that? Because I'm love. So we're always looking for a mechanism or a transaction or some kind of vending machine justification for forgiveness other than the very love of God. And it's just not, that. So there you go. Decisive revelation of God's nature, decisive, definitive, and then the decisive victory over what we could call dread, darkness, and death, or Satan, sin, and death, however you want to say it. Something changed forever that day, including retroactively. It's amazing. He transcends time, and the whole cosmos now, all of history, begins to revolve around the cross. It's not just a place on the timeline of history. It now becomes the center of the cosmos. In the ancient church, they called it the axis mundi. It's like the axis of the world. So, yeah, it's a much more beautiful gospel.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In my book, there's a chapter in More Christlike God that does the gospel in chairs, but you can also just look up Jersak chairs Denver, and in half an hour I'll describe all of the differences between how I used to preach the gospel and how I preach it now. And when I just present that, I watch tears shooting out of people's eyes, because it's so liberating to hear the power of the gospel.
Yeah, I love it. One of the things there that is just so helpful, particularly for people that have wrestled with deep shame throughout their spiritual journey or just their life in general. There's this constant sense of, does God like me today or not? Did the thing that I just did turn God away from me? And again, we have this sort of language in hymns and language in sermons around the Father turning his face away. And yet one of the things that, this presentation of the gospel insists is that God is always turned towards you. And we might turn, but God never turns away, and God's posture towards us is always that self-giving, co-suffering love, and we don't need to doubt that. Hey, just a quick pause to say thanks for listening and to let you know about a couple of ways you can dive deeper into our community. We've got a Facebook group where listeners can continue these conversations. Just search Spiritual Misfits Discussion Group if you want to join. You can message us through our website, spiritualmisfits.com.au, where you can also find the Spiritual Misfits Survival Guide, which includes some short videos and suggested practices for navigating faith and doubt. If the podcast has been helpful for you, you can leave a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can share an episode with someone you think would connect with it. Or if you want to support us financially, there are details on the website for how to do that. Spiritual Misfits is brought to you by Meeting Ground. We're an alternative, grassroots faith community. We're now part of the Sydney Central Coast Presbytery of the Uniting Church. We're really grateful for their support, which helps bring you the pod. It means so much to have you with us. Let's get back into it. You mentioned before that the choice was sometimes presented as, you have God pour out his retribution on Jesus, or you in eternal punishment. And this is obviously the other piece that becomes a major stumbling block for people, whether they stay in the life of faith and continue to have fear over them that they may somehow still end up in hell, or people that, that becomes so reprehensible that they go, why would I want anything to do with a faith system that has that as a kind of 50-50 outcome for people? I think you describe yourself, Brad, as a hopeful universalist, if you still kind of use that phrase. Could you describe a little bit more what's going on there and how you think about, that side of the old equation between God punishes Jesus or sends you to hell forever? how would you kind of remedy some of those ideas that people might still have?
Sure. Sure. Yeah, I started in on this especially in about 2009 after I began, well, I was still in my bed. I wrote this book from hell called Her Gates Will Never Be Shut. And a big part of it was I was meeting people who really had encountered Jesus and loved him but said, "But I can't become a Christian because I can't believe he would burn my loved ones in hell
Mm.
forever." And there was a lot of Christians coming, sneaking up to my house and my deck and quietly saying, "I still love Jesus, but I have to renounce my faith because I can no longer believe that God would burn my loved ones in hell." So they actually thought they couldn't be Christians. And of course, the alternative to that, now I'm going to critique that phrase, uh, hopeful universalism, in a positive way. So first of all, the response to like this horrific idea of God incinerating people, but supernaturally keeping them alive for billions and billions and billions of years so they can continue to experience the torment of fiery hell. I mean, that's cuckoo. I think about it. but but then what's the alternative? And so you get something called universalism. I want to call there's two layers to that. If you use the word universalism, usually people think they know what you mean, and then they turn the switch off. So first of all, I want to say there's a kind of universalism that's very popular, and it basically says sin doesn't matter, Jesus doesn't matter, the incarnation doesn't matter, the cross doesn't matter, the resurrection doesn't matter, faith doesn't matter, and there is no final judgment. I'm like, well, that's not right. um, and so if that's universalism, count me out. So I typically don't like the word very much, but in the early church, there was a clear stream of the top theologians, including Gregory of Nyssa, who's the final editor of the Nicene Creed, who would just absolutely say all of those things I just named are a means to an end. And that end, Jesus tells you what it is. If I'm lifted up, I will draw all people to myself. I think he's right. I will draw all people to myself. If if is sin a problem? Absolutely. It's a fatal disease. Does it need a great physician? Absolutely it does. That's why Jesus came. But the problem with sin is it also kills you. So he goes to the cross so he can enter death and conquer death, so he can bring back everyone with him through his resurrection. Does a willing faith response matter? Absolutely. And Paul says that's exactly what will happen. Every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus is Lord. But that's not in this life. Who said it has to be? Death has been conquered. It's better in this life so you don't waste your life. Wouldn't it be awful to come to the final judgment, meet Jesus, and say, I wasted my whole life? And when we see that, there'll be weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth. And then he will wipe every tear from our eyes. And mercy will triumph over judgment. But there will be a judgment because I can't enter the kingdom of heaven with all my shit. I need that cleansed away, and he will wash away every stain. And so I see all of those things: sin, incarnation, Jesus, death and resurrection, final judgment, response, absolutely necessary to the gospel, which the New Testament tells us between 30 and 50 times, depending how you count them, that if you read to the end, God will be all in all, and every eye will see him and ultimately confess him as Lord. So then I don't, so that's what we could call that patristic. That means the early church fathers. We could call it patristic universalism or inclusivism, or they used a Greek word, apokatastasis. That's from Acts 3, where Peter just says he forecasts the restoration of all things. And Colossians 1 says the same thing. It's like everybody, all people are going to have been reconciled, and that ends in a glorious way. Or this is the summing up of all things in Ephesians 1. that everyone would be summed up in Jesus. It's just is really good news. But and then I want to critique hopeful, because when I think it's a good word, but people think I mean wishful thinking
Mm.
or hopefully this will happen. No, no, no. Hope in the New Testament is an objective future, and his name is Jesus. So when I say, oh, yeah, I'm hopeful in this way, my hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness, that he is the blessed hope prophesied in the pastoral epistles. And so I'm a particular kind of universalist with a particular kind of hope. And what I see is that there's a really solid root of this in the early church teaching, and in fact in Paul and in
Mm.
Jesus. Then I don't have. Then people are like, "Well, what about all the judgment passages?" I don't have to shy away from those or dismiss them. It's just that those are penultimate. That's a fancy word for second last. What's ultimate is salvation and reconciliation. And the judgment passages, because they're penultimate, mean that they're about restoration rather than condemnation. And that's how I would read them.
Mm. Very helpful. Thank you, Brad. One of the things that brought to
Welcome.
mind for me, I guess, something that has shifted significantly in my faith over recent years is, I guess, a humbling, an epistemic humbling. I used to be very confident that I understood how everything worked and I had all the truth, and in particular that as a Christian, I was part of the tribe that, broadly speaking, had things right. And you can go broad or narrow on how you define who's in that camp. But then all those other
Yep.
religions and all those other worldviews and all those other people are just, well beyond hope. And I suppose in recent years, I've seen so much Christianity that to me looks so much uglier than some of the beautiful forms of Islam or Buddhism or other worldviews that friends of mine have brought to me, or First Nation spiritualities, and so I suppose I wonder, how do you, this is a constant question for me, and I see people do it well, but, to be confidently who you are, to own your identity and your tradition, because it doesn't help anyone to be just unmoored, but to be
Yep.
that while also having this constant room for the mystery and the showing up of God in all kinds of traditions and places and languages and names. Do you know what I'm saying there? Like, how do we be confidently who we are without being exclusivists? Because I would say that I kind of identify at this point as an inclusivist Christian, believing that the reconciliation of all things will happen in ways far bigger and
Yep.
wider than I can currently conceive.
Yeah. Well, this is exciting because I'm just starting to write a book about this called A Feast for All. And the subtitle will be Jesus All Embracing Gospel. And so some of your language is so helpful, I think. Well, all of it was so helpful. I don't mean some in a restrictive way, but just that it resonates. And there's a few ways to think about that. So, for example, I love that you said that it's not helpful to be unmoored. If we try to come to interfaith dialogue as if we don't have any tradition ourselves, then we are expecting that of the other person. So if I treat, well, I'm just a pluralist, and all all traditions are simply cosmetic, so Jesus kind of doesn't matter to me so much, man. Well, then when I talk to Safi Kaskas, my Muslim friend, he's like, no, 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 you can't do that, because then you're expecting the Quran and Muhammad to be cosmetic to me. You have to come to this table from a
Mm.
place, from a tradition, and now we have something to talk about, and we can talk about Jesus, and we can talk about our scriptures, and so people think sometimes that they are being gracious by leaving their tradition behind as they come into those conversations, and it's actually puts an expectation on the other that's not that they can't live with. um, but then that means, okay, as a Christian, how do I see what's happening in those relationships where they clearly do have some kind of connection with God, and yet I'm from, how do you explain that? So there's a few ways. One would be to say that uh, I believe that God has revealed himself to us in Jesus, and that's my song. And they have their song, and I can appreciate their song. Some songs are ugly though, and some songs are beautiful. Sometimes I have holy envy at their songs. Sometimes their songs and mine harmonize beautifully, and so and then I can say I think somehow God. Rowan Williams says it this way: that God is like water. He will pour into any crack you give him, even Christianity, and even Islam, even Sikhism, even Wicca, even if there's an opening, God loves us so much that He will pour into whatever space we make for Him. Then the traditions we have, the songs we sing about God, the theologies we develop, that's not God. That's our effort to reach out to God, which He doesn't condemn. You know, we're groping for Him, and He responds to that beautifully. In The Shack by Paul Young, this concerns Mac, the key character, and he says to Jesus, "Wait, it sounds like you're saying all paths lead to God. Is that what you're saying?" And Jesus in the shack goes, "Oh no, most paths lead nowhere, but I'll travel any path to find somebody."
Mm.
So so that's another way to see it. But I'm constantly looking for. It's easy to find differences, but I'm looking for, wow, where am I seeing resonance, and where is God showing up, even by another name, if that's what He needs to do, and then where might their traditions bring a correction to me, and where might my experience of God contributes to something helpful to them. I'll give you an example. So I have a great friend named Peter. He's Wicca, but when I hear him, I'm like, you know what? He's discovered some stuff about the environment that I think would be Christian, but we lost the plot, and so he's foregrounding something that we need to embrace. On the other hand, there's a kind of Wicca, at least, that believes in triple karma and a non-personal God. I'm like, well, Peter, have you ever experienced grace? And he's like, actually, I have. And so we have these beautiful conversations where he's come to love Jesus. And I'm like, well, that's interesting. Because I didn't even try to evangelize him, but
Mm.
we through our friendship and through curiosity and humility and respect for the other, we've discovered that we maybe we have more in common and to share, and anyway, uh, not many witches have burned Christians, but I can tell you we've got some repenting to do.
Mm.
We're on the wrong side of that part of the history.
Mm.
So um, that's in a nutshell where I'm going to try to go with my book a little bit,
That
and
excites me. I'm
and
looking forward to reading that.
it's
Yeah.
beautiful. Yeah, I think you'll resonate when you
Yeah,
see it.
gorgeous examples, and it just makes me think that there's a difference between, I guess, owning our tradition and, like I said, just saying that's part of where I come from and who I am, but it doesn't mean I own truth or goodness or love or God. Like, you cannot own those things, and so whenever you're talking to
No.
anybody else about anything circling in those waters, you just both come as children, trying
Yeah.
to observe and discuss and explore.
Well, and this is at the heart of Jesus' teaching, So he doesn't say, "Blessed are the Christians; they'll be called children of God." It's "Blessed are the
Mm,
peacemakers." And I know a lot of Christians who are warmongers, and I know a lot of Muslims who are
mm,
peacemakers. And then in the same sermon, Jesus says, like, there's going to be people who say, "Well, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? Did we not cast out demons? Did we not?" And I mean, they have apparently charismatic ministries and claim Lord. I mean, he's like, I have no clue who you are, because wow. I mean, ultimately, I have hope for such people, but in that passage, he doesn't recognize
yeah.
them. And you've got the parable of the two sons, where the one's God says, like, or the father says, "Go out and do work the field," and the guy doesn't. And he tells his other son, like, "Go out and work the field," and his son says, "No, I don't think I will," but then he does. I think that speaks to what you're just talking
Mm,
about. There are those who name the name of Jesus and have the Christian sort of brand, and have and they he's like, say Lord, Lord, but don't do what I say. Come on. And then there's these others where it's just like at the end of The Last Battle, was it in C.S. Lewis, where you've got this guy who thinks he's been an opponent of Aslan, and he's actually been an adherent the whole
Mm.
time through his character and
Yeah.
actions.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the things you mentioned earlier that I'm interested in is I guess some of these tensions around. I feel like there has been a shift towards orthodoxy and Catholicism in people who are
Mm-hmm.
leaving some form of Protestantism or evangelicalism because they've become deeply dissatisfied with it. They might go,
Yep.
there's something richer and longer standing about those great traditions, and potentially there's healthier images around, things like penal substitutionary atonement, eternal conscious torment. They might be kind of absent in other parts of the tradition that are longer. But like you said,
Yep.
sometimes there's also a social clash where maybe we have kind of theologically progressive views that would fit well in those spaces, but in terms of queer people or the rights of women or the nationalism stuff that you're mentioning, those spaces
Mm-hmm.
have their own set of problems, which again makes it hard
Yep.
to find a spiritual home, makes it hard to find a
Yep.
place to identify with, and maybe many of us just feel like nomads. I'd love to hear some more of your
Yep.
thoughts around, the draw towards orthodoxy and Catholicism that maybe more people are experiencing, but also then how to
Yep.
reconcile some of those uglier things that are rearing their head that you spoke about, and where do we find ourselves in amongst all of that?
Yeah. Oh, that's really good. So I think you're describing a longing for something deeper. For there can be, I think there's like temperaments. So I have a conservative temperament, meaning I'm not looking to escape the tradition. I'm looking for to go back to the roots of it, and that's not for everybody. But for me, I'm like, there is a shallowness to some of what I had experienced, and I need to go down deep and to a place that's not just theologically deep, but where there's a mystical depth to it, and where there's a resonance to in the theology around the God who is only love, and that anything else we say about God, like righteous, just, holy, those can only be adjectives of his love. They can't be as over against it, or they're not. So I was looking for theological depth. Um, there's also those who are looking for the aesthetics. So there can be for some there's a temperament that's iconoclastic, meaning they want to get rid of all form and all imagery. I get that, but for me, I love the beauty. I love the icons. I love even the pageantry. You know, um, I love the ancient hymns which have reformed my theology than more than any of the writings. The hymns
Mm.
themselves is how the Orthodox teach theology, and it's awesome. So you've got all of that. You've got like the liturgical services are. It's not just pageantry; it's a passion play in which the people participate in an interactive script. It's like the Rocky Horror Picture Show, almost, like where you're talking back and forth, and you're like, oh, this. And every Sunday you're hearing the story from Adam to the resurrection, and then you're always, and then the orderliness to it, like it's predictable enough that it helps people like me who went through nervous system damage in a burnout. When you've been overstimulated and maybe you have ADHD problems and maybe you need counterculture, I can go to a club 6 nights a week. I don't need another club Sunday morning. I need counterculture. So all of these things can be very attractive, and I affirm them. Um, here's the downsides. The downsides are, if in those systems there's things that are exclusive and repressive, then I think we're dealing with the burden of of traditions made by humans that are missing the point. And some of it is just cultural rules, and human culture and human participation and human creation of religious patterns isn't bad until it is. And so you end up like, wow, I sure like the last four popes, or six or seven popes. They're on a roll with their popes in a way, and I like that the service is only an hour long, and I always know what's going to happen. I like all of that stuff, but man, male only priests, same problem in the Orthodox Church. Male only priests. What's that about? And then here's a joke. I'll risk a joke, but it's sort of like, what's with the condemnation of queer people? We know what to do with them. We make them bishops. So why would you condemn regular folk? And so we've got some of these things. My colleague Andrew, he's Orthodox, and he says, some of this you're always going to find problems, and the problems you find can be part of your growth if you continue the walk as if you have a pebble in your shoe. I'm like, that's true until the pebble's a piece of infectious glass. And that's why, for me, I'm like, the Christian nationalism, the misogyny that's actually increasing at least in the Orthodox Church, and those kind of things, or even the claim that it's the one true church. I call BS on that. Like, my great uncle, Bradl Jersak, was a Baptist who was tortured for his faith in Czechoslovakia, while the Orthodox priests were KGB. So don't tell me what a second-class Christian is. That kind of. I'm very hard on those people. One True Church. I met them at my door several times just this week. Which cult are we today? So what am I doing with that? Well, can either become cynical, which is just, it's kind of prophetic, except the cynic is the opposite of a prophet in this way. They both see through the subterfuge, but the cynic steals hope and the prophet deposits hope. So I'm looking for who is depositing hope right now. And that's why I'm currently attending this Episcopal church with a female priest, and that is completely inclusive and affirming of the queer community. I'm like, oh, that feels right to me. My wife leads a church that's affirming, but hers is sort of the vineyard style. That's a low church, informal and spontaneous, and whereas I do experience a spiritual need for a Eucharist. That is a robust Eucharist. So even my wife and I, we're on very different paths. But my confessor, Bishop Varlam, and my godfather so I haven't renounced the Orthodox Church. I'm just saying where I attend. But my confessor said it this way to me: Eden, that's my wife, Eden must be completely convinced that you are completely convinced that the path she is on is holy and God has set her there, and it's not for me to dissuade her. So even to your listeners, I'm like, I don't know what path you should be on. I would say you should ask God, what path have you put me on? And I will walk it. And it's for me to say, I'm convinced that that path is holy. I'm convinced that I don't need to recruit you. But I will say, find Jesus and follow him. And he may lead you. You don't know where he'll lead you. He may even lead you out of a church. He may lead you to a church. I would hope he would lead you into belonging and community. But that's going to have new forms now. So my primary fellowship actually is not a church. It's a 12-step meeting. But I'm enjoying these Episcopalians who where I don't have that glass in my foot anymore, and they are not nationalists, thank God. So,
the term spiritual misfit can sound like a negative one, but I think everything that you just articulated is the most affirming and beautiful way of understanding, none of us are going to perfectly fit anywhere, and yet we can, I guess, find our sense of belonging across the overlapping spaces and affirm people that are in different spaces to us as well.
Yeah, I do want to give an example of that in America. And that is like and also I see this in Wales sometimes, and it is sort of like, I'm a misfit. I don't fit in the camp. It's like, guess where Jesus was crucified? He was crucified outside the city, are you sure you want to be in so much?
Yeah.
And so I see the Black church in America as really that connection between the lynching tree and the cross, and it's outside and it's in the margins. I'm like, that's closer to where the cross was located than at the center of power. So misfit is probably on the right track in my mind.
Yeah, good example. All right, I got one one more question for you, Brad, and then I'll let you
All
get
right.
back to your life. But it's been wonderful chatting. This question is actually from a friend of mine. I messaged a few people who have also appreciated your work and asked, what would you ask Brad if you were sitting down with him? And my friend Caro basically said, as someone who has been through your own significant shifts and then has helped guide a number of other people navigate the shifts in faith, do you find yourself at this point in time in a more settled position, or are there things that are, new shifts that are taking place for you at the moment, Brad? And I think you kind of alluded to this with maybe your next book and things like that, but are there moves happening right now? Is God opening up new things for you that are causing a good kind of unsettledness?
Yes, that's a great question. So first of all, yeah, in terms of my theology is continuing to be more expansive in a way that I think is Christ centered, but absolutely all embracing, which frankly is what Catholic means, all embracing. Um, but the trick for me, the tension for me, and I don't think there's a resolution to it necessarily, but is um, the dramatic levels of injustice in the world. I'm particularly torn apart by what's happening in places like
Mm,
Gaza, and now with what appears to me the rising fascism in America. That's just two examples, and it's crazy making at one level.
mm,
And so the tension is like how to engage that. Sometimes, there's a time when I'm a bridge builder. I'm actually pretty good at being a bridge builder. In our school, we are able to reconcile people on the right and left politically and theologically. We get them around one table and they begin to love each other and hear each other, and then we generate these peace builders who go out into the world in places like Northern Ireland, South Africa, Santa Barbara, um, and the Middle East. And so I feel really like that's an important thing, that Jesus calls us to being bridge builders and peace makers. At the same time, how do you build a bridge to fascism that's abusing people unrepentantly and rejoicing in genocide and things like that? And so on social media, I'm like fluctuating between I've got to bear witness or else I'm like the people who turned their back on the Jews in Germany. On the other hand, when I speak out, it can feel like, geez, I'm just being reactive. It feels unfruitful, and it's not from a place of peace. So how do you do both? And that's where I feel like the growing edge for me is like when to shut up and when to speak up, um, when to affirm and when to condemn. Um, and I can feel like that compulsion can turn me into a zealot in a really bad way. So I don't just want to, so that's a hard thing right now. How to bear witness in the world of horrendous atrocities, not abandoning those people to my silence, but while also not just becoming the next terrorist out there. So
mm,
if you that, I think that many of us are in that boat right now,
yes.
and we're working it out, and we're going to have to see, probably it's individual callings too,
Mm,
where some are called to be silent and pray, and some will be on the front lines and speaking up, and we're going to have to say, I'm convinced that the place God has you on is holy, even if it's not the place He has me. And we need both.
mm, mm,
Um, as a facilitator, I struggle with that consciously, and I pray about it all the time.
mm. Yeah, I appreciate that answer very much. Thank you, Brad. And everything you've shared in this conversation has been very rich, and I really appreciate it. I'd love to give you the last word, the last phrase or sentence. I mean, you've plugged St. Stephen's, but do feel free to do that again. And then anywhere else you want to send people to engage with more of your work. But then I'd love to just hear what would be the phrase or the word or the sentence that you'd want to leave people ruminating on coming out of this conversation.
Yeah. Okay. Well, come wrestle with these things. You're allowed at ssu.ca, you are allowed to ask any question you want. We're not that safe a space, but we're a brave space where you can wrestle with the hard stuff, and there's no professor who will pounce on you for anything. As a last phrase, I think I want to come back to the cross and just say, I've come to this conviction for my song is this, that God is love. And if you want to see that love in clearest focus, look at Jesus as as he shows us God is self-giving, radically forgiving, co-suffering love. And I hope you'll experience him that way. You could invite him to show you that too.
Beautiful. Thank you, Brad.